Good afternoon. I'm Brett Perlman, CEO at the Center for Houston's Future, and I'm pleased to be hosting today's webcast on a vision of Houston as a low-carbon energy hub. For those of you who don't know us, the Center brings together business, government, and community stakeholders to engage in fact-based strategic planning and collaboration of issues of great importance to the Houston region. Today's webcast is part of our series on energy and climate and part of our low-carbon energy initiative. For the past 2 years, we've worked extensively on developing a vision for Houston as a low-carbon energy capital. Last year, we published an extensive report along with our partners at the University of Houston and the consulting firm KPMG called Houston, the Low-Carbon Energy Capital, which is available on our website, and held a major conference called Houston, the Low-Carbon Energy Innovation Summit. At that conference, we unleashed our research, which you see here, the Houston Low Carbon Energy Assessment, in which we identified 4 areas that we think are crucial for Houston to become a low carbon energy capital. And over the past couple weeks, we've now published 2 white papers along with the University of Houston, one on hydrogen and one on CCUS. So today's webcast is an opportunity to begin to discuss our vision in detail that's in those white papers and to take the steps that need to occur to make this vision a reality. And so here's what our vision might look like of Houston as a center of a low carbon energy hub that might stretch across the state of Texas and then become a global leader in decarbonization and in providing solutions to the to climate change. So today, to discuss this vision, I'm pleased to welcome 3 of our major collaborators in this project: Center board members Cindy Yeilding and Andy Steinhubl, and Director of the Center for Carbon Management and Energy at the University of Houston, Chuck McConnell. To introduce each one of them, Cindy has 25 years of experience and recently retired from BP America as Senior Vice President in December of 2020. She chaired the National Petroleum Council Carbon Capture Use and Storage Study, which was published in 2020 as well. And in addition to the center, she serves as board chair for the Offshore Technology Conference and was recently appointed into the board of Denbury. And she has served as board of directors on the executive committee of the Greater Houston Partnership. So welcome, Cindy. Andy Steinhubl recently retired after 35 years as a consultant at KPMG as leader of the U.S. Energy and Chemical Strategy Group. And he previously had been at Booz, where he served as the Houston office managing partner and had been also a partner at McKinsey & Company. Andy led KPMG's pro bono project for the Center of Houston Future, several, actually 2, one on our economic viability, and has been working with us on a hydrogen study, which you'll see in a second. And he is currently our vice chair and serving on the executive and nominating committees. In addition to his service at the center, he serves as an independent director of FlexGen, a leading battery energy storage system provider. And finally, I'd like to introduce Chuck McConnell. And Chuck is the Energy Center Officer at the Center for Carbon Management and Energy at the University of Houston. He served as Assistant Secretary of Energy in the U.S. Department of Energy from 2011 to 2013, and was responsible for the Office of Fossil Energy Strategic Policy, Leadership, Budgets, and Project Management. And previously, he worked at carbon management at Battelle Energy Technologies and at Praxair. So today we're going to start with Cindy's historical perspective on the National Petroleum Council study, and then we'll hear from Chuck and Andy about the findings from the joint study that we conducted with the University of Houston, and that looked at how we're going to become a leader in creating a low carbon energy hub. After the 3 presentations, we'll have a moderated discussion and followed by some Q&A at the end of the conversation. So please use the chat function to submit your questions. So let's get started. I'll turn the floor over to Cindy. Cindy, thanks.
Hey, good afternoon, and thank you, Brett. Hi, everyone. We appreciate you including us on this esteemed panel. On behalf of the over 300 participants in the NPC CCUS study team, we'd like to share a very high-level overview to help set context for today's discussion with Chuck, Andy, and Brad. So moving to the next slide, just a little bit of background on the study. We always like to start with what the heck is the NPC? So the National Petroleum Council is a federal advisory committee which exists solely to advise the US government by conducting studies. Our story commences in 2017 with a request from Secretary of Energy Rick Perry asking the NPC to develop pathways and a roadmap for how the US could move forward with the development and deployment of carbon capture, use, and storage. Secretary Perry's letter specifically asked about US and global future energy demand outlooks, the environmental benefits from CCUS, R&D, technology, infrastructure, and economic barriers to be overcome, how to establish a framework to guide public policy and stimulate private sector investment, and then probably most importantly, what regulatory, legal, liability, and other issues need to be addressed to help us move forward. So one thing we always like to note is the Secretary's letter did not ask, should the US move forward with CCUS? The need for decarbonization is clear from an environmental perspective, and there's growing demand for society to move forward. And while carbon capture, use, and storage is not the only answer, what we demonstrated through the report is that it can play a critical role in all of the above solution in any attempt to address emissions reductions. And we confirm that CCUS should be a key part of the US's decarbonization strategy. So moving to the next slide, we're not actually starting from scratch. So the US is actually the world leader in CCUS deployment already, or at least when we were doing this study. We have many decades of successful enhanced oil recovery experience. About half of the industrial scale projects in the world, and I think, Brad, it's just the next slide, or 80% of the world's capacity while we were doing this study resides in the US, and we have 5,000 miles of CO2 pipeline. So we also have a long, rich history of support from the US government with leadership in R&D in the Department of Energy. We actually have world-leading policy, and 45Q is a great example of that, and an established regulatory framework for CCUS. So we still have a long way to go, though. So one of the things that we had to tackle, and we'll probably see this once we get the slides going up, is really what the heck does at scale mean? Yeah. So we spent a lot of time working on this to try to make sure we were answering the right question. And we finally settled that moving from the 25 million tons per year of CO2 that we were currently capturing in the US, from moving from that to about 500 million tons per year of CCUS capacity in the US was a good representation of significant progress and could represent the place at scale in the US. And that represents roughly 20% of the US emissions from stationary sources, or about 10% of all US CO2 emissions. So if we move to the next slide, one of the differentiators of this study was the economic cost assessment, which supported the framework for the report. We conducted a thorough bottoms-up analysis of CCUS costs across the largest stationary sources of carbon emissions in the US. This analysis was generated using costs for proven technologies, amine-based capture, pipeline transport, enhanced oil recovery, or saline for storage. So nothing kind of pie in the sky, it's things we can do today. The costs that we used to build our curve were actually developed by a broad range of specialists with hands-on expertise, experts who are supplying equipment for projects, people who are involved in designing, executing, and operating projects, people with true business knowledge of the costs of CCUS today. We wanted to share some insights on this work today because it's a critical part of the NPC study, and also because it provides the foundation for the work that Chuck will describe next. This illustration is, this curve is an illustration of the results of the cost modeling we just described. We're going to walk really quickly through it to help you orient you to the approach and to the outcomes. First, this slide will illustrate some of the elements of the work. The x-axis is volume of CO2 emitted from stationary sources in the US in millions of tons. So we use data from the EPA and the EIA, focused our analysis on CO2 generated from the top 850 emission sources, or 80% of the US stationary emissions. These point sources included CO2 from ethanol, power plants, cement, steel, natural gas processing, fertilizers, and others. The x-axis is not a timeline. James Stricker, I know you're out there and you always tell me that. It's not a timeline, but it represents total cumulative emissions. The y-axis represents the cost per ton to capture, transport, and store for each of the point sources in the model. The curve is arranged by lowest costs to highest costs. And what you see highlighted on this particular slide are 3 illustrative examples of the 850 point sources. We've got one for ethanol, which is probably on the far left-hand side of the screen, one for cement, and one for natural gas processing. The lighter color indicates the cost of capture, which you can see is the dominant cost for all 3 of these examples, capture of CO2 emissions. And the darker color indicates the combined cost for transport and storage, or transport and use. Our financial assumptions are provided. Our goal was to be super transparent as possible in this study, to help people really sort of understand and get to the bottom of how our costs were produced. And while each point source was modeled using the methodology described, the actual cost of any specific project could be higher or lower than the cost displayed in the model. So the team also developed a tool that you can link to from the National Petroleum Council website. It's actually stored through Gaffney Klein, and you can model your own sort of pseudo projects or cost curve with your own cost assumptions if you like, and you have a different framework from the one that we've developed. So this cost curve, like I said, provided a framework for a lot of the recommendations we made in the study. And the next few slides, you will see 3 phases of deployment. So this first phase, which we call the activation, is actually represented by this dark blue segment. This gives us a jump start on, and it's done through clarifying existing federal tax policies and regulations. The next slide will demonstrate what we call the expansion phase. And what you see in this kind of medium blue wedge are future projects or future emissions that can be captured in an economic sense. And it's built upon using congressional enhancements and regulatory agencies and enhancements or expansions of existing policy. The third section of the chart which is what we call the moving to at scale phase, represents moving towards the 500 million tons per year of CO2 abatement. And this level of deployment that we've illustrated could play out over, we estimated, about 25 years. So the final slide, yeah, there we go. As I mentioned earlier, these costs are developed using proven technologies and the costs available today, but there's a lot of room for improvement, even on proven technologies with known costs. And these yellow arrows represent what could be cost improvement from successful RD&D initiatives. And in this model, we estimated that about 10 to 30% cost reduction could be achieved through RD&D and efficiencies simply on amine technology. So that's the cost curve. Let's look next at these 3 phases as they might actually be deployed. So the first phase, which is activation, illustrated on the left-hand side of the screen, this is the phase that gives us a jump start, and it's no new policies are created, but we just clarify existing tax policy and regulations. Many of these actions are actually now underway, such as clarifying 45Q, and no congressional action, as we mentioned before, is required. This will take away a big obstacle, uncertainty, and these actions could double US capacity over the next 5 to 7 years to about 60 million tons of CO2 captured and stored per year. This phase, as you can kind of see from the map, the sources and the sinks are very close to each other. So it's delivered primarily through local CO2 emissions sources being transported to nearby subsurface storage sites, primarily enhanced oil and recovery. So the next phase, the expansion phase, will require Congress and regulatory agencies to expand and extend existing policies and strengthen the legal and regulatory framework for CCUS projects in the US. If taken, these actions could result in another doubling of CCUS capacity over the next 15 years. And the map illustrates the type of expansion CO2 sources and sinks that could be enabled across the US. And we're seeing more CO2 transported a little bit further to subsurface storage. Phase 3, our at-scale deployment phase, requires additional financial incentives and policy support to continue investment to build towards 500 million tons and beyond per year of CO2 abatement. This level of deployment is estimated to occur over about a 25-year time frame. And what you can see in the map is a wide range of sources and sinks with a broad pipeline distribution system across the continental US, illustrative of what the CCUS at-scale supply chain could enable. So, and as we previously noted, because of the potential impact of RD&D, the report calls for an investment of about $15 billion of government-funded RD&D over the next 10 years to support fundamental research, pilot programs, and demonstrated projects to help focus improvements through emerging technologies. So these are our 3 phases illustrated for the US. And just to highlight, you can find all this on the report on the NPC website. There are significant job and economic benefits to growing CCUS as well. So the next slide, just a highlight of the key messages. The report is in 3 volumes and over 600 pages, so it's kind of hard to summarize it all in one slide. But the takeaways that we'd like to leave you with today, the US is the world leader in carbon capture, and we are uniquely positioned to deploy CCUS at scale. CCUS can be deployed today. However, the economics are extremely challenging, and deployment at scale requires clarity, a stable and enduring policies and regulations, and ultimately incentivization to catalyze development. Investment in research, development, and demonstration will create further applications and potentially drive down costs. One of the things that we think is so exciting is these actions can stimulate a new industry in the US, creating jobs, capability, and economic growth for a global marketplace, not just the US. And finally, we want to emphasize, and this is really important for the sort of Houston and South Texas area, we believe that the oil and gas industry can play a pivotal role in ensuring the US leadership in the CCUS deployment. Oil and gas sector has experience in designing and deploying major projects required to execute at-scale deployment, a deep knowledge of full integrated value chain systems, and experience in developing and deploying new technologies. So, final slide, in closing, a whirlwind tour. As I said, if that wasn't condensed enough, you can find in the CCUS report a 2-page roadmap, which kind of summarizes most of the things we've talked about and our highest level recommendations, along with the cost curve illustration and sort of where we think technology could go. And we've also got a number of other recommendations that are captured in the study that may be important to you. So at scale, deployment of CCUS in the US is intriguing, potentially highly beneficial endeavor, not only from a policy and a business perspective, but also for a society that is demanding a lower carbon future. The 3 volumes of the report offer insights on how to develop and implement this shift. And like I said, if you Google the dual challenge, National Petroleum Council, you can download every aspect of the report. So as always, I'd like to thank and recognize our many, many contributors. This was really a labor of love. And we encourage you to read through the list of experts who helped to answer Secretary Perry's question. We did this for the US, but it was clear throughout the study that one of the most attractive potential hubs in the US is in the Gulf Coast. Fantastically, Chuck McConnell and the US and UH and Energy Management Institute have built upon this foundation, and they've integrated it into their paper, highlighting the potential role for Houston and the Gulf Coast to lead in the energy transition. Indeed, they've even included key contributors from the NPC study, including Nigel Junby, James Stricker, and Scott Nyquist as part of the advisory group for their work. So now, after that whirlwind tour through the NPC study focused on moving the US forward in carbon capture, use, and storage, I'd like to turn the floor over to Chuck McConnell to share an overview of the exciting work that his team has delivered.
Well, Cindy, thanks. Great setup for this. I was very fortunate to be part of that NPC study group. And as you said, with over 300 stakeholders, it was really incredible. But I think the big takeaway that came away is that, okay, we've got this look at everything across the country. But being from Houston and being confident in terms of industrial expansion and the wherewithal to get things done here in the Houston area, we actually commissioned our study to take the NPC study construct down to ground level and put a group together and look at how might we get Houston as a city and as a surrounding group of counties to net zero by 2050. To take that NPC study construct and actually regionalize it. Next slide, please. So with that in mind, why CCUS? Cindy covered that, and the impacts in terms of long-term sustainability and really the existential threat to our industries here in Houston, a big part of that. And why Houston? Well, we're not only the energy capital, but we want to be the sustainable energy capital. But we've got infrastructure and scale suitable for these kinds of clusters that Cindy was talking about. We've got vast proximal geology that's unlike anywhere else in the world. And the energy companies here in our region are very much committed to this concept of getting to net zero and having that drive behind it. But I think it's important to mention one other aspect, and that is the whole workforce transition. We've got a bunch of people in the oil and gas industry, the petrochemicals industry, and electric power industry that often are referred to as the jobs that are going away. And we didn't actually believe that. We did not embrace that. We understand these energy companies are going to pivot. They are going to make major transitional changes to get to net zero. And the concept of taking advanced technologies such as CCUS as a significant part of that pivot, I would argue, are the greenest of the green jobs going forward that we're going to require. And it was a fundamental part of this in terms of the economic growth, the economic benefit, as well as the environmental benefit. Next slide. So with that in mind, what are our objectives? And maybe you could hit the next button for the slide. We had objectives and findings. And again, I mentioned the NPC study and the 3-phased approach. We'll talk about that in just a second. It's really a mirror of what the NPC study looked at. And looking at the optionality that CCUS has in our region and the findings based around strategic investment requirements, we looked at it from a very pragmatic business analysis standpoint in terms of investment, returns, and the potentials around that. So really taking that cost curve really to another level and beginning to unpack the investment economics. We looked at a mix of EOR and pure storage and the geologies we have available and the current base of those technologies. But I also want to emphasize the 3 counties we focused on in and around Houston, but we looked at the larger proximal 9-county Houston region, and then thinking about it in terms of the entirety of the Gulf Coast and for the state of Texas. Yes, we need government policy support, there's no doubt about it, but we also took a look at the uniqueness of Houston, existing infrastructure, existing capabilities that we have, and we believe like nowhere else in the world. And so let's take this study and see what we can do in terms of our region. Next slide. We've got challenges in capture, transportation, and storage. There's no doubt about that. These challenges exist everywhere. But if you look at these 3 areas in particular, the Houston region has significant advantages over the general look across the country here in the US, or we would argue also around the world. We have existing infrastructure that we can leverage, and we have a unique business construct here in Texas that's really open for business to accelerate this. And as I mentioned earlier, storage, geologic capacity like nowhere else in the world. Next slide. So we looked at it the same way as Cindy described it, an activation phase of the next 3 years, an expansion phase of, 10 years, the next phase, another 10 years, and finally, taking it all the way to net zero. And what this chart does is, Cindy mentioned 800 some different point source emissions. We actually zeroed it down to 52 point source emissions in our region, specific to natural gas combined cycle power plant generation, refinery operations, steam methane reformers, all of the unit ops that are in the different chemical companies and refining companies that we have here in our region, and actually looking at the specifics using Gulf Coast costs in terms of the development and deployment of these technologies. And again, taking the general statements from the NPC study and actually putting a fine point on them for our region. So you can page through the next several. You can see that those phases in those 10-year increments, and then go to the next phase. So if we look at activation, we have a unique circumstance here with the Denbury pipeline that runs into our region. You can see the number of point source emissions identified, the proximity to that pipeline, and the fact that that pipeline is really about only 1/3 utilized at this point. So we have a wonderful opportunity to act and act fast in places where those emissions and those facilities we can address at a very, very advantaged cost position. Next slide. If we look at that pipeline and where it extends, it goes east and all the way through a number of different geologic regimes as we go east toward Beaumont and then on further into Mississippi. Phenomenal geologic capacity, as I said, unlike anywhere else in the world. And so to be able to activate and move into these regimes right now was a key to our activation phase. Next slide. So we looked at the economic model. We took a 20-year cash flow, looked at it with project economics, and we put in a number of aspects into the model to actually dig into what are the returns and what are the criteria and what are the key sensitivities. And again, you see the major scenarios. We looked at 100% enhanced oil recovery scenario. We looked at a 100% saline scenario. And in both of those cases, of course, the federal tax credit is significantly different. $35 a ton for EOR, $50 a ton for the saline. But we have the ability in the model to move it around and do a 50-50 split, whatever. So again, adjustments. Key assumptions that were made in terms of the cost curve, looking at the discount rate and being able to actually evaluate it on an all equity basis. We didn't do any fancy financials around it, but of course we all know there's a number of ways that this can be utilized in terms of modeling. It's not meant to be the answer. It's really a construct for all of those interested in getting into this industry to have a baseline model to work from and to really talk turkey in terms of what kind of investment and returns. Next slide. So with that in mind, there are some key sensitivities, and typical in any kind of modeling. In the EOR case, obviously the price of oil is a big contributor, and the oil recovery. The sensitivity around that is very dramatic. There's no getting around that. But what we did in the modeling was convince ourselves that a positive NPV with 12% all equity return criteria is possible. It's not necessarily probable, but it is possible. And it requires some key influential parameters around the oil price, the recovery factor, the 45Q rate, et cetera. But again, the model's designed so that those sensitivities, risks, and impacts of all of those risks, rank order them, and then you can begin to actually unpack it. We did this from an overall project standpoint, not individual contributors along the way. And of course, that's another level of detail that would be required in any major project. This could easily be switched to 100% saline or any combination otherwise, but it does take strong advantage of the fact that we have existing infrastructure to work from, and that's based into this cost model. So it makes a big difference for the economic modeling. Next slide. So the key takeaways, obviously, we're looking at low-cost strategic Houston emissions. They're very close together. We have a lot of industries close together that can be aggregated, and the transport to the Denbury pipeline, very able to get to. We've got a lot of geologic capacity, not only onshore, but offshore as well. And we looked at either of those options and the risks associated with that. And then, of course, the different parameters and the sensitivities around the NPV. Now, that's phase one for activation. And if you page through this, if you look at phase two, there'll be significant more investment necessary for infrastructure and the build outs. Phase three, in broad deployment to actually take our region to net zero. It really contemplates extensions up into Dallas, out toward the Permian, offshore. We have a lot of different ways we can go. And of course, the future will require significant investment. But the truth of the matter is, CCUS as an investment option, many will say it's too expensive. And we would argue, compared to what? And we believe that it's not too expensive. We see it as a cost-effective and important tool for emissions reduction, but also, again, for the transformation of the industries and our workforce in our region to be able to create that future that we're all a part of. CCUS also does something incredibly important for the electric power industry by decarbonizing baseload power, the circular plastics economy. But the next speaker you will hear from is Andy Steinhubl. And a big part of the hydrogen economy going forward is underpinned by a CCUS network that is prepared and made ready for that hydrogen conversion that we're moving into. So again, CCUS not as a way to perpetuate the hydrocarbon industry. It's a way to affect the energy transition in the most cost-effective and impactful manner. So let me hand it over to you, Andy.
That's great, Chuck. Really appreciate your teeing up, and I couldn't agree with you more. And Brett, thank you for the opportunity to join Chuck and Cindy and overview the outtakes of the hydrogen work we did on behalf of the center and in collaboration with U of H, a team of KPMG strategy professionals and U of H students undertook this effort to both look at the overall role of hydrogen within decarbonization strategies across the globe, as well as to bring it back to the greater Houston area and a specific vision and roadmap for hydrogen within our region. Go to the next slide. So let me start overall with the role of hydrogen within decarbonization strategies. Hydrogen, along with overall energy efficiency, shifting power generation from the current mix increasingly to wind and renewable resources, and electrification, being for the first three levers, are then complemented by hydrogen, which plays at the margin with electrification to get at areas of the economy that are hard to abate the emissions. So what the chart shows on the right-hand side is areas such as light transportation, electric vehicles, for example, lend themselves to batteries plus power as a decarbonization solution, removing gasoline. Batteries can play a role in extending the role of renewable power, balancing intermittency and putting more renewables on the grid. Electricity can be used to substitute for fuel oil or natural gas in light industry. So there's a role for electrification in those applications. But where batteries and electrification have a harder time going is where the heat intensity or the duration of batteries have a difficult time meeting the need. So that would be in areas such as heavy transportation, starting with heavy trucking, where the weight of the batteries and the charge time, et cetera, aren't a good fit with the application. Hydrogen is a good solution for longer duration storage on the grid, an increasingly renewable grid, because batteries have a hard time exceeding 2, 4, et cetera, hours. And we may need more hours than that, 6, if not even days, weeks, and potentially even seasonal storage. There are also applications where hydrogen is needed as a molecule, such as part of the refining process and certain chemicals manufactured. And then as well in processes, chemical processes that create steel and create cement. So those are areas where hydrogen can go that electrification can't go. So hydrogen works in concert with the other three levers as part of an overall approach to get to net zero 2050 as an objective. There are a couple different ways to make that hydrogen. One way is known as green, which is shown on the upper portion of the diagram. That would take renewable power, wind or solar, use electrolysis, which uses electricity to split water into hydrogen and oxygen. And then the hydrogen is used for applications, as I mentioned. Or the current path, and particularly in our region, would be to take natural gas, go through a process called steam methane reformation, which strips the hydrogen out of the methane, CH4. That produces the hydrogen and releases CO2, which I'll come back to in a minute. That's far and away the predominant manufacturing method of hydrogen around the world today. So if we move to the next slide, so the question is, how do we get on the left-hand axis what I described as a typical method of splitting methane before you capture the CO2? That's known as gray hydrogen. How do we get from that, where the world is today, to 10 times the hydrogen supply, which is what's needed in the estimation of the Hydrogen Council to meet all the needs I outlined on the prior slide? So we have a 10x growth in demand, and we need to get there. And the question is how to get there. And the answer to that question is going to be driven regionally by things like, does the country or region have a 2050 net zero goal? Do they have incentives or policies in place to support that goal, such as a carbon fee or a carbon tax? Do they have an existing refining system and other systems that make hydrogen? Do they have the CCUS assets available, depleted reservoirs, a pipeline and other infrastructures, as Chuck and Cindy outlined, available to them? And then on the green side, do they have wind and solar resource, sun shining, wind blowing, that makes that an available option for a particular country or region? And then at the bottom, there's the overall improvement in the cost and technology. Green is more of a nascent industry. There's very little hydrogen produced today, as I mentioned, by electrolysis. There's a lot of cost and scale improvements to be made. In electrolysis, there's a lot more renewable energy that has yet to be built. Renewables globally are on the order of 10% of the generation base. There's a lot more room for that chain to scale and the economics will improve, and that'll have an effect across all regions and states. So the question is the mix, and that'll come down to the specifics of each region, the timing of the mix and the shape of the blue versus green. As an example of one country who's thought that through and put a plan in place, I'd like to talk a little bit about Rotterdam because it's an interesting analog to the greater Houston area. Rotterdam is widely known as one of 3 major global refining centers, along with Houston and Singapore, and historically has played a role of a commodity hub for refined product in the Netherlands region and in greater Europe and beyond. And what they're looking to do is pivot to become a northeastern hydrogen hub, which builds off of the fact they produce hydrogen today, as mentioned, for their refining and petrochemical system. That's in the middle left of the chart. They're adding to that a CCUS capability, which is in the upper left, known as Porthos. So they'll start to capture that the CO2 and convert that gray hydrogen into blue hydrogen. They plan on supplementing that through a green energy park. BP and Shell both have announced projects there, which will adopt the electrolysis process I mentioned, supported with renewable offshore wind and other renewable resources. They'll build out what runs across the, from left to right, the pipeline system to encompass ever increasing volumes of hydrogen. And then the orange and the other nodes are feeding into markets, many of those markets being regional. But then, as I mentioned, over there on the far right side, feeding into other places in Europe. So overall, pivoting from being a traditional commodity and refining hub to being a hydrogen hub in the future. Next page, please. So now kind of taking it to potential for Houston and implications for the greater Houston area. Well, Houston, I think Chuck alluded to this a bit, is already home to the world's largest refining system. We have over 900 miles of hydrogen pipelines. That's over half of what exists in the US and about a third of what exists globally. We make well over 3 million metric tons of hydrogen annually, as I mentioned, largely through steam methane reformation. That's over 8.5 times of what the Netherlands makes. So we're a major producer today. We do that out of 48 scale hydrogen plants. And in addition to that, and we'll come back to this in the future, we have a unique opportunity to store and inventory hydrogen because salt cavern storage exists around the greater Gulf Coast, which can be tapped for inventory to distribute both regionally, broadly, domestically, and could even be used to support an export trade. So we've got a substantial existing asset position. The other thing that the team thought about was markets, because we're looking at a full chain and we're looking at moving into new markets. Most of the hydrogen today flows into the refining and petrochemical system that overlays the hydrogen system I just showed. But this was about creating new markets for hydrogen and accessing some of the areas that I mentioned on the first slide. So we prioritized hydrogen markets in terms of what's the hydrogen competing against, either an existing fuel or another alternative energy solution such as electrification. How much infrastructure, new infrastructure to be needed to access that application. That's on the y-axis. And then on the x-axis is how much emissions impact do we get from that market application. And the sweet spot, which emerged from our work, and this is one that's emerged in the studies that others have done, is in heavy transportation and initially in heavy trucking. And you can see there at the bottom, the Canadians have looked at this as well and have called hydrogen the anchor tenant in the energy mall. Others have called it the killer app of hydrogen application. So if we go to the next slide, we investigated that in the context of the greater Houston area. And I won't go into the details here, but the red in the upper graph is an indication of heavy trucking density. And like a lot of patterns in Houston and across Texas, there's a significant density of that activity across the Dallas, San Antonio, Houston triangle. Houston has a large degree of regional trucking, chemicals typically moving to export from plants across the ship channel and the greater Gulf Coast. We also connect with Dallas. Dallas is a national distribution hub. It takes in containerized goods from the West Coast and breaks bulk and ships them through the Midwest of the country. And San Antonio is a major corridor for Mexican shipping. And Dallas and San Antonio, of course, integrated with the Houston market. So we have the opportunity to tap into very dense trucking markets. The economics are on the lower portion of the chart. Again, I won't go through these in detail, but the punchline is that we can very quickly get to scale, tapping into those dense trucking markets and break even and do better than break even with diesel, which is the existing solution. And even using gray hydrogen can reduce emissions from current diesel emissions. If you go to blue hydrogen, the emissions impact is even further increased. So we've got at least an initial market to get the value chain going, new market for hydrogen. If we go to the next page, none of this precludes, we have the opportunity, as highlighted, to move forward very quickly with volumes at scale, taking gray, converting it to blue, expanding into new markets. We also have a green opportunity, which is important and important over time, as it is elsewhere in the world. And Texas benefits from many low-cost pricing hours, typically from wind and solar, that results from the fact that wind is blowing or sun is shining when demand isn't necessarily high for power. So a lot of low-cost hours available. That's an asset that can be tapped for green hydrogen, because green, as you recall, consumes a lot of power through electrolysis. So cheaper power enables those economics. On the right-hand side, the other thing about the greater Houston area is very high seasonal swings. This is typically, recent polar vortex aside, typically we have very wide spreads between summer, which is our usual peak, and winter, our off peak. And if you couple that with the hydrogen storage caverns, we can make hydrogen when prices are low, bank it and pull it out and use it either through fuel cells or can be burned in combination with natural gas to provide power when prices are higher. So we've got some unique resources that can play into hydrogen and green hydrogen as well. Again, that's more nascent. Will take more time to scale those chains, but it's another asset available in our area. So if we move to the next chart, putting that all together, and I realize this is a real Cook's tour, an abbreviated version. The full paper, as mentioned earlier, is on the website. But that same hydrogen system I mentioned earlier is shown hugging the Gulf Coast. And what's new on this diagram is that we're also showing an influx of green coming in over time. You see that out in West Texas, which is in the upper left. You see that in the lower left, which is the Corpus Christi area, Southeast Texas. We can expand our blue hydrogen capacity, drawing on low-cost methane. That's the wells in the upper left that can feed into the hydrogen system along the Gulf Coast. We can inventory blue and green hydrogen. In the center of the diagram is a depiction of the salt cavern storage I referred to earlier. And then we can feed that hydrogen out into a number of markets, local markets, our trucking market, as I mentioned earlier. We could export it to California, which has an incentive, low carbon fuel standard. We can put it into shipping. We can use it for port equipment, and then we can put it on the water and export to markets that are short. So a number of options. So we can feed in blue in the near term, midterm, green over time, and be in a position to be a hub supporting regional, domestic, and even global needs.
Okay.
And these thoughts have been captured in a recent Chronicle article as well.
Okay, great. So that was really 3 great presentations, and I'll get Chuck and Cindy maybe to put their videos back on. And we have a few minutes for questions. I guess one of the questions that I saw in the chat and we discussed was this increasing sense of urgency to address climate change. And what are the implications of that? We were showing sort of a 2050 timeline, and a lot of countries have now started to pull their timelines into 2035. So maybe you guys can talk about that and the implications for trying to move forward on this agenda in Houston. Who'd like to start?
I'm happy to make some comments on that. The UN anticipating the upcoming COP, Council of Parties, the countries involved in the Paris Accord and other climate dialogue are going to convene in November. In anticipation of that, the UN has been revisiting where the globe sits on emissions and has come to the conclusion that we're not on the right track to meet a 1.5 degree increase in temperatures, and that we'll have to achieve something like a 7.6% reduction in the decade between now and 2030. And that, I think, does, to your point, Brett, put a whole new light on how quickly things need to get moving. And what troubles me is the disconnect between some of the things I've seen which show hydrogen, for example, becoming a meaningful solution in a 2040, 2045 timeframe, whereas the urgency coming from the UN and has been echoed by the UK Climate Action Committee, who's now looking to bring their 2050 target forward to 2035. We've got to start doing things at a much bigger scale sooner. And I think that overlays well what Cindy and Chuck and in the case of CCUS and myself and hydrogen have been saying. We've got some tools in the Houston toolkit that can be leveraged and make significant impact in this decade. Which is more difficult to do with some of the newer technologies that have yet to scale and yet to reach competitive costs.
Yeah. Andy, do you see, maybe some unintended consequences by having these sort of backward dated curves? Do they have some negative consequences in terms of that time frame you're talking about? People waiting for green as opposed to blue. Any thoughts on that?
I mean, we're dealing with uncertainties to a degree. There's a lot of models out there that speak to carbon budgets, and some say we don't have much time at all. Some say we have 15 years, but I think overall they're in the ballpark of 10 years. Well, if we let the clock tick another 10 years, we just start to increase the risk, and we're already seeing what might be argued as an extraordinary set of events, whether wildfires in California and wildfires in Russia and polar vortex in Houston, Texas. So, call it the handwriting on the wall. It just seems to me that there is a risk to back end solving the problem and that we ought to get moving sooner. And I think Houston can play a significant role in supporting that.
Yeah, Cindy, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, just to augment what Andy is saying, I mean, I see this as a real call to arms, because I think folks who have been working in both the hydrogen and CCUS space, we've been talking and planning and projecting for decades. And so I think we really should take this as a catalyst for moving strictly from idea generation and talking to actually planning, executing, and doing, and getting started. So, I think that is really what needs to happen, and to our ability to come together as a group of metropolis, as a group of industries, as a society, to actually start to move forward with some of these major projects. I think it's time.
Yeah. Chuck, talk a little bit about the role that you're at the University of Houston is going to play in that, in your center in particular.
Yeah, well, we embrace the concept of frankly, we need all of the energy sources that we can possibly have in the coming 50 years. The world's demand for energy, for electrification, for hydrogen, all of the things that we're talking about, they all need to be decarbonized. And it's not all going to come from purely renewable sources. So what we do is we look at the in the carbon management opportunity to look at existing industries, existing fuels, existing technologies. How can we transform the world that we're living in through technology evolution? And whether it's hydrogen or decarbonized electricity or the circular plastics economy, or certainly CCUS, these are effective ways to act now, capture emissions. We don't need another meeting at a fancy hotel in France. What we need is to take action here in Houston with the infrastructure that we have, with companies that have an oar in the water and made the declaration, and we've got a unique place to do it here. So we believe it's important that all forms of decarbonization and emissions reduction get the kind of enthusiasm that they need.
Yeah. Well, I'm hearing from all three of you this idea of a sense of urgency to get started. Yet we're not seeing, I don't think, the pipeline of projects in Houston. Why do you think that is, and what do we need to do about that?
Well, let's be real. I mean, Andy mentioned Rotterdam, and we know about a lot of things that are going on around the world. And we have European governments that are handing out a lot of big money to many companies to do projects. And that's good. I don't know that it's necessarily commercially sustainable. And I think what we tried to do is create a framework that says commercial sustainability is an achievable target. It's policy, it's convening, it's the support and the structure that we have in our country to make these decarbonization investments easier to do, enthusiastic support of the government behind it, not this constant comparison between one technology versus another, and let's pick a winner. We need to do it all, and we need to do it now.
Yeah. Well, one thing that we talked about, I guess, when we were preparing for this is I am trying to get started, to find a project to get started with. What do you think the barriers are to that? Or what would it take to get something to happen, do you think, in Houston?
Well, when we were conducting the hydrogen work, Brett, we talked to a number of different players. And if you consider a chain as complex as the hydrogen value chain, there are a lot of players involved. So someone's got to produce the hydrogen, someone's got to move it. If we're talking about trucking, there has to be a retailer who's interested in that aspect of the business. You've got people who make the trucks, the original equipment manufacturers. You have people who buy or lease those trucks, the shippers, et cetera. So they all have an oar in that water. And right now, that chain, isn't in the money. And they're all looking for, well, who's my customer or who's my supplier? So I think to kind of get this off the ground, and we've seen this like in the Port of LA and other places around both in our country and elsewhere, that you've got to get those constituents around the table and create the right conditions for a successful project.
Mm-hmm. Cindy or Chuck, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, very similar to what Andy's saying. You have different industries, different perspectives, and how you bring folks together. Even folks who look at different returns and use different economic definitions of success. You have to be able to create a project that goes from a power provider to a subsurface storage, via a trucker or more likely a pipeline transportation company. And so getting everybody on the same page and out of their silos is hard work. And shouldn't be underestimated, and probably at least part of the reason this has been so challenging to date.
Okay. Well, we're right at 3 o'clock. I mean, this was an amazing discussion. I want to thank each of you for participating in this. I really do think we've come quite a ways in the couple of years we've been working on this, we really have defined the vision. And to the point that I think we have been discussing today, there is an increasing sense of urgency. And the real challenge now is to make it happen. So I look forward to working with each of you in solving that challenge. I think we at the center have been certainly working on a number of catalytic projects to try to move forward on this. And Andy mentioned the one on heavy duty trucking. That's certainly an area in which we've been focused recently. And so I just look forward to continuing the partnership with University of Houston and with some of our industry partners, certainly with BP, and continuing the discussion. Thank you for being with us today and sharing the thoughts, and look forward to working with all of you going forward. Take care and have a great day.
Thanks, Brett.
Take
Thanks.
care.
Thank you.